In 1968, captured Viet Cong documents revealed something extraordinary. Enemy commanders were ordering their troops to abandon an entire province, not because of airstrikes or artillery, but because of soldiers they called Ma Rừng, the jungle ghosts. Australian SAS operators had achieved what massive American firepower could not. They made the enemy choose not to fight. The jungle in Phuoc Tuy province held its breath in the pre-dawn darkness of March 1968. A six-man Viet Cong patrol moved through the undergrowth with practiced silence, weapons held ready, eyes scanning the shadows between rubber trees. Their squad leader, a cadre named Nguyen, who had survived since the French War, carried orders that troubled him deeply. His commander's briefing had been explicit and unusual. Avoid the western sectors where Australian forces operated. If contact seemed imminent with soldiers wearing slouch hats, break contact immediately and withdraw. Do not engage. Nguyen had read the intelligence reports. Entire VC patrols vanishing in Australian-controlled areas without a single shot being heard. Bodies found days later, killed with surgical precision in ambushes so perfectly executed that victims never knew death was coming. The rare survivors told stories that bordered on supernatural. Enemy soldiers who appeared from nowhere, struck with devastating accuracy, and vanished back into the jungle as if they had never existed. What Nguyen could not know was that 5 Australian SAS soldiers had been observing his patrol for 40 minutes, lying motionless in positions they had occupied for 3 hours. Their faces were painted, bodies covered in vegetation, breathing controlled to near silence. They were not hiding in the jungle. They had become part of it. The lead SAS operator, Sergeant Collins from Queensland on his second tour, watched through his sight. His finger rested near the trigger, but he did not move. Not yet. His team had been in the jungle for 16 days on this patrol, gathering intelligence on enemy patterns. This ambush was the culmination of more than 2 weeks of patient stalking. When they struck, it would be with overwhelming surprise, and then they would vanish. This was not how the Americans fought, and that difference was fundamentally altering the war in Phuoc Tuy province. 300 kilometers north, an American rifle company was conducting a sweep operation through Binh Duong province. 120 soldiers moving in tactical formation, the sound of their movement audible hundreds of meters away. Radio chatter crackled constantly. Helicopter gunships orbited overhead. Artillery at a nearby fire base stood ready to support. It was impressive, professional, and utterly predictable. The Viet Cong in the area had heard them coming an hour ago and melted into tunnels and bunkers, waiting for the Americans to pass. The contrast was not accidental. It flowed from fundamentally different experiences and philosophies of war. When Australia committed the first Australian task force to Vietnam in 1966, establishing their main base at Nui Dat in Phuoc Tuy province, they brought something the Americans largely lacked: recent, successful experience in jungle counterinsurgency. From 1948 to 1960, Australian forces had fought in the Malayan Emergency, a 12-year communist insurgency in terrain strikingly similar to Vietnam. They had learned through trial and blood how to fight an enemy who lived among the population and used the jungle as sanctuary. More importantly, they had won. The lessons from Malaya were still fresh. Australian officers who had patrolled Malayan jungles were now commanding in Vietnam. They understood that insurgencies were not won through body counts but through persistent presence and population security. They knew that patience was more valuable than aggressive tempo. They had learned that the enemy's psychology mattered as much as his casualty rate. Sergeant Collins embodied this institutional knowledge. Before Vietnam, he had served in the Borneo confrontation, conducting covert cross-border operations against Indonesian-backed insurgents. He had learned to live in the jungle for weeks, moving silently through terrain where a single mistake meant death. When his patrol set their ambush in Phuoc Tuy, they were applying lessons earned across 2 decades of jungle warfare. The Australian mission itself was different. Rather than roaming across the country hunting the enemy, Australians were responsible for security in one province. Their goal was area denial, making it impossible for the VC to operate freely. This required understanding where the enemy moved, why they moved there, and how to intercept them. It required patience. Sergeant Collins's patrol had been inserted 3 weeks earlier, walking into their operational area rather than arriving by noisy helicopter. They carried everything needed for extended operations: ammunition, rations, water purification, minimal equipment. Communication was by hand, signal only. Radio use was minimized to essential reports transmitted in brief, encoded bursts. There was no talking, no smoking, no cooking fires. They moved at night when VC forces felt safest, and lay concealed during daylight hours. For 16 days, they had done nothing but observe. They mapped enemy trails, noting which paths were used and when. They identified rest stops and crossing points. They observed VC movement patterns, noting times, directions, unit sizes. All of this fed into growing intelligence on how the enemy operated. Now, in the pre-dawn darkness, that intelligence was about to pay dividends. Collins watched Nguyen's patrol move into the kill zone. Every Australian had assigned targets and sectors of fire. The ambush site had been selected with extreme care. Fields of fire, escape routes, withdrawal paths all planned. They had moved into position the previous night and waited for 18 hours without moving, controlling bodily functions through discipline, enduring insects in absolute silence. Collins's hand signal was minimal. 4 other fingers moved to triggers simultaneously. The jungle erupted. The first volley was overwhelming and precise. Half of Nguyen's patrol was dead in 3 seconds. The survivors dove for cover, returning fire at muzzle flashes. But the Australian fire had already stopped. By the time Nguyen looked up, searching for targets, there was only silence and gun smoke drifting through vegetation. Collins and his team were already withdrawing, moving quickly along a pre-planned route, putting distance between themselves and the contact site. They did not stay to count bodies, did not consolidate on the position, did not call in artillery. Within 10 minutes, they were 400 meters away, moving silently through the jungle. Within 30 minutes, they had vanished completely. When other VC forces arrived to investigate an hour later, they found bodies but no indication of where the attackers had come from or where they went. No helicopter noise, no artillery craters, no massive military presence, just death delivered by invisible enemies who had disappeared like smoke. This was the pattern that was breaking VC morale across Phuoc Tuy province. The psychological impact of Australian tactics was profound in ways that American firepower was not. Captain William Calley's rifle company, conducting their sweep 300 kilometers north, represented American operational doctrine perfected. They moved in strength, coordinated with supporting arms, and could call down devastating firepower. When they made contact with VC forces, the result was often overwhelming destruction, but the VC had learned to fight Americans effectively. They could hear large American units coming. They knew American patterns: movement during the day, defensive perimeters at night, heavy reliance on helicopter support and artillery. VC forces monitored American activities, predicted their movements, and chose when to engage from positions of advantage. When Americans did catch them, experienced VC units broke contact quickly and withdrew before reinforcements arrived. The VC understood American tactics because those tactics were comprehensible within conventional military logic. Americans leveraged their advantages in firepower and mobility. They operated at scale because scale was their strength. The entire system was built around conventional warfare principles adapted to counterinsurgency: find, fix, and destroy the enemy. General William Westmoreland's strategy flowed logically from American military culture. America had won World War II and fought to stalemate in Korea through industrial mobilization, overwhelming firepower, and aggressive offense. Why not apply those proven methods? If American forces could kill enemy soldiers faster than they could be replaced, the war would be won through attrition. Australian tactics defied this logic and therefore defied prediction. Nguyen survived the ambush, one of only 2 from his patrol. When he reported to his commander, he could provide almost no useful intelligence. He had not seen the enemy clearly. He could not say how many there were or which direction they withdrew. The ambush site revealed nothing. No cigarette butts, no food waste, no equipment left behind, no clear tracks leading away. His commander listened, asked a few questions, then issued new orders. The battalion would relocate its base area. Australian patrols were operating too effectively in this region. 2 weeks later, An intelligence officer at Australian headquarters translated a captured VC document. It was a directive from a VC province commander to subordinate units. The language was explicit. Avoid areas where Australian forces are identified. If contact seems imminent, withdraw immediately. Do not attempt to track or pursue Australian patrols. Several phrases referred to Ma Rừng, the jungle ghosts. The intelligence officer had seen similar references in prisoner interrogations. VC fighters were genuinely afraid of Australian-controlled areas in ways they were not afraid of American territory. One captured fighter had described it perfectly. When you fought Americans, you were fighting soldiers and machines you could see and understand. In Australian areas, you were fighting the jungle itself, never knowing if death was watching from the trees. This fear was not irrational. It was based on accurate assessment of tactical reality. The core difference was in patrol philosophy. While American companies moved in platoon strength, Australians operated in 5 to 6 man teams. Where Americans conducted patrols lasting days, Australians stayed out for weeks. Where Americans prioritized aggressive contact, Australians prioritized intelligence and perfect ambush conditions. The Australian patrol structure was intentionally small because stealth mattered more than firepower. 5 men could move through jungle with minimal signature. They communicated by hand signal. Equipment was taped and secured so nothing rattled. They practiced moving through vegetation without disturbing it in ways visible to trackers. They learned to place feet to avoid breaking twigs, to move through vines without leaving tears, to use hard ground and water to avoid clear footprints. But the most distinctive technique was counter-tracking, and it included methods that seemed almost theatrical. Australian patrols would walk backwards through sensitive areas, literally placing feet in reverse to create confusing tracks, suggesting movement in the opposite direction. They created false trails leading nowhere. They spent hours obscuring their actual route and constantly monitored their back trail for followers. Sergeant Collins's team practiced these techniques religiously. After withdrawing from the ambush, they spent 2 hours obscuring their trail, using a stream bed for 500 meters, then moving across rocky ground, before finally settling into a new observation position. Any VC trackers attempting to follow would find a trail that simply vanished. This obsessive attention to leaving no trace stemmed from understanding that the Viet Cong were expert trackers themselves. VC guerrillas lived in the jungle, knew every trail and water source, and could read signs invisible to most soldiers. Australian SAS needed to be better at not leaving signs than the VC were at reading them. The techniques worked because they were grounded in understanding enemy capabilities. The VC were skilled, experienced jungle fighters with home field advantage. Conventional American tactics accepted this advantage and tried to overcome it with firepower. Australian tactics neutralized the advantage by matching and exceeding VC jungle craft. 3 months after the ambush, Nguyen was captured during a cordon operation by Australian infantry. During interrogation, he was asked about VC operations in Phuoc Tuy. His responses were consistent with dozens of other prisoner statements. VC forces actively avoided Australian areas when possible. He described the psychological pressure of operating in regions where Australian patrols might be watching. You could not use familiar trails safely. You could not relax during movement. The jungle that had always been sanctuary became uncertain ground. When asked why VC forces did not adapt similar tactics against Australians, Nguyen's answer was revealing. They had tried. His unit had increased security measures, varied routes, changed timing. Nothing worked reliably because Australians were patient enough to observe changes and adapt. The fundamental problem was that Australians demonstrated equal or superior jungle craft on the VC's home territory. The interrogator asked about operations in American-controlled areas. Nguyen's response was matter-of-fact. Americans were more dangerous in terms of firepower, but more predictable. You could hear them, predict their patterns, and choose when to engage. American firepower was terrifying, but it was comprehensible terror. Australian operations created constant psychological uncertainty. This distinction appeared repeatedly in captured documents and prisoner statements. VC commanders made deliberate decisions to operate in American-controlled provinces rather than face Australians in Phuoc Tuy. They accepted facing superior American firepower because it was predictable and understandable. They avoided smaller Australian forces because psychological uncertainty was more debilitating than physical danger. From a military standpoint, this should have been illogical. Americans had helicopters, artillery, air support, and vastly more soldiers. By conventional measures, Americans were far more dangerous, but the VC were making calculations within psychological context. The known, even if more lethal, was preferable to the unknown. American commanders were aware of Australian tactical success, and some units attempted to adopt modified techniques. When Lieutenant Michael Rodriguez brought his platoon into an area near the Phuoc Tuy border, he had been briefed by an Australian advisor who had served in Malaya. The advice was straightforward: reduce noise, increase patience, focus on intelligence rather than aggressive contact. Rodriguez tried implementing these concepts. His platoon reduced radio chatter, moved more slowly, and spent days observing before setting ambushes. The results were immediate and striking. In 6 weeks, his platoon had 3 successful ambushes with favorable casualty ratios and took no losses. Other platoons in his company, operating conventionally, had multiple contacts with few results and steady casualties from mines and snipers. But Rodriguez's experience remained an exception. The institutional momentum of American operations was too powerful. Platoons and companies faced pressure to show results. Patrols conducted, contacts made, body counts reported. A platoon that spent days observing and had occasional contacts did not generate impressive statistics. The system rewarded activity over effectiveness. There was also a doctrinal issue. American tactics were optimized for operational scale. When you moved a company of 120 men, stealth was impossible. Once stealth was lost, the logical response was maximizing advantages in firepower and coordination. American doctrine emphasized seizing ground, consolidating positions, and maintaining aggressive momentum. The idea of withdrawing immediately after successful contact, of passing up engagement opportunities to maintain secrecy, ran counter to institutional culture. Captain James Mitchell commanded an American rifle company in Long Con province. He had read reports about Australian tactics and even visited an Australian briefing. He respected what they achieved, but could not see how to apply it at company scale. His mission was securing villages, conducting sweeps, and maintaining presence across a large area. That required moving in strength, establishing patrol bases, and coordinating multiple platoons. Australian 5-man patrols conducting weeks-long operations were tactically interesting, but strategically irrelevant to his mission. Mitchell's perspective reflected broader American strategic assumptions. The war would be won through attrition and maintaining South Vietnamese government control. That required large-scale operations across the entire country, not perfecting tactical techniques in one province. Australian tactics worked within their limited scope, but could not scale to the massive American commitment. Yet the tactical results in Phuoc Tuy were undeniable. Intelligence assessments documented significant decrease in VC activity after 1967. VC main force units that had operated throughout the province began avoiding Australian areas. Supply routes were abandoned for longer, more difficult alternatives. Recruitment declined. The province that had been a VC stronghold became increasingly difficult terrain for enemy operations. Sergeant Collins's team completed their 3-week patrol in April 1968, walking out of the jungle to their extraction point. They had conducted detailed reconnaissance, set 2 ambushes with high enemy casualties, and suffered no losses. Their intelligence contribution led to a successful battalion operation the following month. It was professional, effective work that would never make headlines but which cumulatively changed the tactical environment. Across Phuoc Tuy, other Australian SAS patrols were conducting similar operations. The cumulative effect was psychological pressure that never relented. VC forces could never be certain they were not being observed. Any trail might have an ambush waiting. Any area that seemed safe might have Australian soldiers watching in silence. The VC response was rational: avoid the province when possible. Operate elsewhere where the enemy was more predictable. Accept the greater danger of American firepower in exchange for the ability to understand and predict enemy actions. By late 1968, captured communications showed VC forces explicitly discussing tactical preferences. One intercepted message from a battalion commander to higher headquarters requested permission to relocate operations from Phuoc Tuy to Bin Long Province, where American forces operated. The request was approved. The battalion moved north, accepting longer supply lines and less familiar territory to avoid Australian psychological pressure. This represented the ultimate tactical victory, making the enemy choose not to fight in your area of operations. It was victory achieved through psychological dominance rather than physical destruction. But the strategic context remained unchanged. Phuoc Tuy was one province in a countrywide war. Australian tactical excellence could not solve broader problems: South Vietnamese government legitimacy issues, corruption in Saigon, North Vietnamese determination, and erosion of Western political will. Australian forces numbered in the thousands, while Americans numbered in the hundreds of thousands. The scale mismatch meant Australian tactics, however effective, remained tactically significant, but strategically limited. In 1972, Australian forces withdrew from Vietnam as part of the broader Allied drawdown. Sergeant Collins, by then a warrant officer on his third tour, walked out of Phuoc Tuy for the last time. The war would continue for 3 more years, ending with North Vietnamese victory in 1975. Strategic outcomes had been determined by political factors far beyond tactical excellence. Yet what happened in Phuoc Tuy between 1966 and 1972 demonstrated something profound about the nature of warfare. Military effectiveness is not solely about firepower, technology, or numbers. It is about understanding the enemy, operating within their decision-making cycle, and creating psychological effects that change their behavior. The Viet Cong called Australian SAS operators Ma Rừng, the jungle ghosts, because those operators challenged fundamental assumptions. The VC had believed the jungle was their domain, that they understood it better than any foreign army could, that their intimate knowledge of terrain gave them decisive advantage. Australian SAS demonstrated that foreigners could master jungle movement, could remain undetected for weeks, could set more effective ambushes than indigenous guerrillas. This inverted the predator-prey relationship. VC forces who had hunted American soldiers found themselves hunted by an enemy who seemed to understand their environment better than they did. The psychological cost was cumulative and devastating. It manifested in captured orders warning troops away from Australian areas, in prisoner statements describing constant fear, in operational decisions to avoid an entire province. When interrogators asked captured VC fighters why they called Australians ghosts, the answers were remarkably consistent. One prisoner's response captured the essence. When we fought Americans, we fought soldiers. When we entered Australian areas, we fought the jungle. You could not know if trees were watching, if death waited on trails you had used safely before. The jungle that protected us became uncertain, and uncertainty was more powerful than bombs. In the final accounting, this is what made Australian SAS operators ghosts, and why the Viet Cong avoided Phuoc Tuy province. It was not that Australians killed more enemy soldiers than Americans, though their ratios were impressive. It was not that they held more territory, though they secured their province effectively. It was that they achieved something more fundamental. They owned the psychological space of the battlefield. They made professional guerrilla fighters fear their home terrain. The strategic war was lost. North Vietnamese determination and American political exhaustion ensured that outcome regardless of tactical successes. But in Phuoc Tuy province, for 6 years, a relatively small Australian force demonstrated that tactical excellence and psychological warfare could create zones of actual control. They made their enemies choose not to fight, and they did it by becoming what those enemies named them: ghosts in the jungle that appeared without warning, struck without mercy, and vanished without trace, leaving behind only bodies and fear. The lesson survived the war. Modern special operations forces worldwide study Australian SAS operations in Vietnam as a masterclass in how small, highly skilled units can achieve disproportionate effects. The emphasis on patience, intelligence-driven operations, and psychological impact over body count has become central to counterinsurgency doctrine. The understanding that enemy perception and psychology matter as much as physical destruction traces directly back to those Australian patrols moving silently through Phuoc Tuy's jungles. Sergeant Collins retired from the Australian Army in 1975, the same year Saigon fell. He never spoke publicly about his 3 tours in Vietnam, maintaining the quiet professionalism characteristic of SAS operators. But in military circles, the stories persisted. The ghosts who made the Viet Cong fear the jungle, the soldiers who won their peace of an unwinnable war through skill, patience, and an understanding that war is ultimately about breaking the enemy's will to fight. In that mission, within that province, against an enemy that had defeated France and would ultimately outlast America, the Australian SAS achieved complete success. They made the jungle whisper their name, and their enemies listened. If this story of tactical mastery fascinated you, subscribe to uncover more untold military history. Hit like if the jungle ghosts earned your respect, and drop a comment telling us, what other elite unit tactics should we explore next? Your engagement keeps these legends alive.